and her daughter Anouk arrive in a small town and open up a chocolate shop. The single mother is progressive in her style of clothing, in her mannerisms, and in her very casual attitude about religion. The townspeople, with their staunchly religious mindsets, are not enthused with this newcomer, so enticing customers into her chocolaterie during the 40 days of Lent, no less, takes some doing and some time. When a few coerced souls try the chocolate, though, they are transformed. One by one, the townspeople come to life, not in the church, but outside of it, under the lure of delicious confections. The transformation is so complete that one of the few holdouts, Mayor Renaud, becomes convinced that this is the devil's work, and he obsessively tries to run Vienne out of town. In a climactic scene, Mayor Renaud completely loses his composure. He breaks into Vienne's chocolaterie and lays waste to the absolutely gorgeous window display that she has created. He overturns the tables, and it would seem like a righteous Jesus-like act if he wasn't so very, very wrong. More about that in a moment. Does anyone know what movie I'm talking about? I see some hands. Yeah, Chocolat, yeah? I invite you, if you have not seen this film, to choose your favorite chocolate treat, assuming you haven't given that up for Lent, and sit down for a cinematic delight. It could be the subject matter of many sermons, and it has especially obvious themes related to the sacrament of communion. I invite you to hang on to that image and that story, that movie, for just a moment as we turn to our passage today, because it's quite the doozy. So we have reached the heavy-hitting passage of Jesus's in all of the scriptures. Jesus arrives at the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. The story goes that he is angered by what he sees. The money changers and marketplace merchants have taken residence inside the temple, and Jesus just loses it. In John's version of the story, he actually takes some cords, makes a whip, and completely trashes the place. Many pastors, myself included, have used this passage as inspiration for talking about righteous anger. Jesus getting angry at the face of injustice, and ergo we should too. There is a message there, and many of us who have differing comfort levels with anger will take different things from it. But yes, Jesus gets angry. We should all become sickened and angered at the presence of injustice in our world. We should always, always stand on the side of the marginalized in society, as we see Jesus doing time and again through his life. And I wonder if that's all that this story is actually about. At a minimum, I would suggest it is not all that it is about. So let's take a closer look. Jesus is at the beginning of his ministry here in the book of John. Now, in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this story comes a lot later in the story of Jesus, and it's often considered to be justification for his arrest and trial. It is the first case of destruction of property on the books, but it comes right before the events of Holy Week. But here in John, it's positioned differently. Jesus is just starting out in his ministry, which means that the book of John has other things to say about this. Jesus is just starting out. He has just turned the water into wine at a wedding, an odd first miracle in and of itself. And then he heads to the temple to make an awfully big and bold and angry statement. And to be honest, it's a confusing statement too. Biblical scholars have noted that the marketplace Jesus finds there was one created out of total necessity. The temple paid taxes at the time, and it was a tax that had to be paid in temple coinage, which was different from other coinage. So they needed to have actual money changers present to be able to pay the tax to continue to exist. Any of this sound familiar? Cattle and doves and sheep and the like were also needing to be there for temple sacrifices. According to Leviticus laws, they had to be unblemished animals, so of course it would make sense to sell them right at the temple gates rather than to cart all of their animals all the way to Jerusalem, sell a few, and then bring the rest back. All of this is to say, these financial matters were being done in service to the temple. And it seems that all of that matters not a whit to Jesus, who still whips and overturns and yells and declares all of this to be absolutely terrible. As a small nonprofit organization, our church works towards remaining fiscally viable and strong. Just this past week, I want to celebrate this. A small group of members of our church met multiple times and worked extremely hard to apply for a certain grant, which we hope will help, if we receive it, with needed improvements to our building. Many, many thanks. You know who you all are, but seriously, that was hard work for a $50,000 grant. Thank you. We all know that we receive no outside funds for our staffing or for our programming. It all comes from us. And we talk about financial matters quite openly here at the church, to be transparent, to be honest about those things. But I hope we do not do so at the expense of remaining spiritually healthy. Money matters, but we are also stewards. Money has a symbiotic relationship with the work we engage with as Woodmont UCC. Mission should fuel monetary giving and vice versa. It is meant to ensure that our visioning work and our missional work and our justice work all move forward. It is not meant for accumulation or comfort. This is where the temple seems to fall short for Jesus. The money stuff got too big. It threatened to push spiritual matters to the side. It started as something good and necessary, but it got too big. I can picture Jesus seeing the marketplace tables push in and crowd out the faithful who are gathered for prayer and fellowship. If the temple had had council meetings at the time, the bulk of the agenda might have been about money and not about the holiness of God's presence in this place. Sorry, that place, or this place, It makes me wonder what practices of ours that Jesus might see and not be, what practices of ours are there that Jesus might see and not be too happy about? What common practices would he affirm? Which would he want to overturn? These are hard questions, but they're worth sitting with. And we're going to continue to have sermons of stewardship peppered throughout the year. Best practices in churches say that stewardship need not be just a season, but really we should be talking about this a lot. So here we go, right? Our capitalist culture, though, is fond of claiming that the church is a business and should be about growth and numbers. That certainly does not seem to be what Jesus espouses here. Jesus was about sharing the news of love widely, but he couldn't have cared less about fiscal stability. In fact, the New Testament is rife with examples which caution against the implications of that stability. So that's very interesting. There's a space and a necessity for money, but we worry when it gets too big and crowds out other things that we are to do as people of God. Back to the temple. It's curious that the onlookers don't seem to be confused at all about Jesus' actions, neither here nor in other versions of the story. The disciples are usually often seen in the scriptures as kind of a confused bunch. Jesus, why are you doing this? Tell us. The fact they aren't asking here is very telling. What the bystanders do ask is, Jesus, on whose authority do you do such things? And here Jesus says something truly astounding, which I think is the pivotal moment in this passage. Not that the overturning the tables isn't important, but this is more so. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Of course, our ears now know he's talking about his death and resurrection. However, we need to bear in mind that at that time, this would have made no sense whatsoever. Destroy the temple, though, that would have gotten people's attention. The temple in Jerusalem was uniquely holy for the Jews. People would travel far and wide to visit this holy space. It was believed to be God's residence, quite literally. Jesus is saying that he is replacing that holy place with something else, with a person. It is the belief that God need not reside in a building, but instead resides within Jesus. That is very interesting here, because if the holy resides within Christ, the holy also resides within all of us. That would have been staggering for Jesus' listeners. God lived in the temple. The temple was ornate and opulent and extremely large and the literal seat of holiness. People gave sacrifices to God in the temple. People prayed for divine help in the temple. Impure people were not welcome to the temple. The temple was holy and separate and lifted above other buildings in the eyes of the Jews. And here Jesus says, destroy it. There is a better temple on the way. Beloved of God, how often do we think about this? The idea that God literally has chosen to take up residence within our bodies, our very physical, limited bodies. If we truly believe the temple is no longer a place but a person, and now by virtue of the incarnation and resurrection, the temple is all of us, what would it look like if we lived as though it were so? How would we approach one another if every time we did so, we consciously thought, I'm approaching God right now? It's an astounding thought. And by the same token, how would we treat ourselves if we remembered that we are indeed divine temples of the holy? We probably wouldn't run ourselves in the ground, as society likes to tell us to do. We probably wouldn't always seek more, because we would know that we are, in and of ourselves, holy beings. Being a temple of God also flies in the face of I'm never good enough. Those tapes that remain so embedded in many of our brains, because of course we are good enough. God lives in us. God has chosen to live within us. That means we are absolutely good enough. There is a promise in this passage of holy presence, not just looking down at us from heaven, not even just accompanying us on the way to the cross, but present inside of us, giving us breath and joy and worth and value, giving us life, giving us insight and strength and the ability to tend to others, knowing that they too hold that same loving presence inside themselves. We are, each one of us, resurrected temples, which means that together we can accomplish so much more than when we are apart. In her chapter on joy, Cole Arthur Riley talks about how experiences of joy and lament are inherently communal. She references the Psalms, which frequently call to mind God's presence found in community, and she connects that to her own presence in her family. As she writes, previously having struggled to be present in those things, she says, in time I learned to be in the kitchen, and it didn't seem to matter if I was laughing with everyone else. My sister pulls me close and feeds me a bite of spinach dip. Just stay with me, end quote. I think we are prone to forget our communal mutual care, and I think we are prone to forget the sacredness that we all hold. This is Communion Sunday. We are invited here not to overturn a table, but to approach one. This is a table that has been set for us that gives us a reminder of our divinity, the gift of God's presence free of charge. At this table, we are reminded of Jesus' broken body, the temple that was destroyed into pieces. We take our piece and we consume it. It becomes a part of us. In some instances, as Riley describes, we feed each other. Beloved of God, here at the table, the temple that was broken into pieces becomes a part of us. God resides in us. Back to chocolat. So our lovely mayor overturns the table, and it would seem a righteous Jesus-like act if he wasn't so very, very wrong. It's a heartbreaker to watch. In his chaos, though, a little chocolate happens to land on his lips. He gets his first taste. He stops, and then he tastes some more, and some more. Pretty soon he cannot get enough of the stuff. And what was at first, a frenzied destruction has turned instead into a feverish consumption of delicious, joyful holiness. of which he had deprived himself for so very long. He joins the community who sees. He falls asleep at the front window in a stupor of chocolate inhalation, and Vian rouses him, and as the presider over a holy table, she hands him a cup and says, "Here, drink." He realizes he was wrong to doubt Vian and the chocolate's inherent goodness and the work of God in this woman and her creations, and he apologizes, and she responds with deep grace and forgiveness. So the passage of Jesus overturning the tables, classically about righteous anger, and there is truth there. There's a place to rail against the wrongs of this world. But we are not Jesus, and sometimes we fail to see the temple in another. Sometimes we're wrong in our self-righteousness. Sometimes we think we're on the side of rightness when in reality we're just fighting the chocolate lady who has come in with a word that is different from ours, but is no less holy. And that, beloved of God, is, I think, the point. This passage is about anger, but it is also about finding God's temple in unexpected places, within others, and even within ourselves. Taking a piece of what is given to us as free gift, consuming it, and letting it nourish us for the journey ahead. And then living as though God were not just residing in one place, but in all places. Broken bits of communion bread, consumed. The Spirit alive and well dispersed and inhabiting all of God's children. This is why whenever I'm asked if the church is necessary, this is why why can't I go and do my own spiritual thing? I respond with, we miss seeing God in each other if we try to do it alone. I need my own time of solitude and contemplation too. I like the sunsets. But I also need to feed and be fed by others. The temple broken and dispersed, creating a more beautiful whole. The promise of holy presence within each one of us, each voice, each individual, each contribution, each gift matters. Beloved of God, may we live as though it were so. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.